Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Daniel here with another From the Bookshelf book review video. So today we are looking at One Christmas in Washington, Churchill and Roosevelt Forged the Grand Alliance by David Bercuson and Holger Herwig. So just to read from the blurb of the book, it says, the story of how, in the darkest days of the Second World War, Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt met over Christmas in Washington and launched their grand strategy to defeat the Axis powers. By Christmas Eve 1941, the war could hardly have been worse for Britain or the United States. Barely 3 weeks earlier, the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, where they sank 5 US battleships. A few days later, the Royal Navy lost the battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse to Japanese torpedo bombers. Events in the Far East were similarly grim. Soon Japanese forces were landing on Hong Kong Island, on the Thai and Malaya coasts, and invading the Philippines. In Europe it was no better. A week before Christmas, the Italian Navy penetrated Alexandria Harbour in Egypt and sank the British battleships Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. In North Africa, Rommel's Panzer unit had come to the rescue of the beleaguered Italians. In the Soviet Union, German infantry detachments had reached the Khimki tram station less than 12 miles from downtown Moscow, and Leningrad was under siege. When, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war, Churchill agreed to brave the German U-boat patrols in the North Atlantic on HMS Duke of York for a meeting with President Roosevelt. These took place over Christmas and the New Year, because neither the new British Chief of Staff, Alan Brooke, nor Churchill's private secretary, John Colville, accompanied their boss. Their otherwise complete and revealing diaries, for one, say little or nothing about what happened. The full story of how Churchill, who suffered a heart attack during his visit, and Roosevelt spent 3 weeks charting the future strategy of the Allies, has now been pieced together for the first time by David J. Bercuson and Holger H. Herwig. One Christmas in Washington shows how two very different nations learned to work together, and how Churchill and Roosevelt, two super-egos, were joined by a common purpose to win the war. So, this book was published in 2005 by Winston Churchill. It's available in hardback and paperback. It is 320 pages long if you include the index. In terms of pure text, it is 275 pages long, so not the longest book in history, equally not exactly the shortest. It's a nice size for a hardback. The writing, reasonable size, no complaints on that front. Even the sort of quoted text, that's reasonably large. No issues at all in reading it. There is a plate section with approximately 30 photographs showing pictures of Churchill, Roosevelt, the White House, Pearl Harbor, Dunkirk, which all add context to the story. So this book, it begins in August 1941 as a way of sort of setting the scene, and what it looks at first of all is the meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt in Placenta Bay, Newfoundland, where they wrote the Atlantic Charter. So that's included here to sort of set the scene in terms of the beginning of the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, with that being sort of their first summit, before looking at how Churchill learned of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They reckon that he'd just finished his evening meal, dinner, tuned the radio in at 9 PM to listen to the BBC News headlines, and it was mentioned that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, whereupon Churchill reportedly said that, now the Allies could not lose the war, and he immediately called Roosevelt and asked if the news of Pearl Harbor was true, to which Roosevelt said, unfortunately it was. He said that we are, and I quote, all in the same boat now, whereupon Churchill suggested a meeting. And less than 2 weeks later, he was on board the King George V class battleship HMS Duke of York, heading across the North Atlantic for a meeting in Washington D.C. So it is a very interesting read. It's only 14 chapters, and the first 4 of those are to do with, as I mentioned, setting the scene, sort of talking about Roosevelt, Churchill, the Atlantic Charter, and also the effect of Pearl Harbor. And then the rest of the book very much focuses on sort of forging the Grand Alliance. So it is an interesting book in that you can't study the Second World War or read about the Second World War without knowing something of the conferences, even if it's a case of knowing that a conference happened. You know, there's the big 3 meeting at Tehran, the Yalta Conference, Potsdam, hundreds of conferences. Quebec is another one, Placenta Bay. So this sort of falls into that, but for me, I find it somewhat unique among Second World War literature in that this book is dedicated fully to the summit, so it's interesting. Well, it's an interesting subject in that regard. It's sort of a hybrid book. It's somewhat political, but also historical, which is where the value lies, because while there's been a multitude of conferences and we've got different accounts of what took place at them, such as Avril Harriman's accounts of the various conferences that he attended, which his book was entitled Special Envoy, I believe. And obviously in Churchill's work on the Second World War, his 6 volumes, he includes details of the conferences and how things appeared from his mind. But these very rarely take up sort of more than a chapter, whereas this book is dedicated to one conference. So it was interesting just to sort of get the details from that. So there's the whole Atlantic crossing made by Churchill. What comes out is his fear of U-boats and how Dudley Pound said to him that effectively they had nothing to worry about in terms of the U-boats. He's reportedly told Churchill, when Churchill questioned the danger, that Duke of York was far more likely to ram a U-boat on the surface than she was to be torpedoed by one, which was an interesting point to make. Then obviously there's conference is discussed, the press conference or news conference which was held, Churchill's heart attack, and then how it was suggested that Churchill go on vacation for a few days, a holiday to Florida, before rejoining Duke of York. It also discusses in here his brief trip to Canada and also his address to the joint session of Congress. So, I mean, the conference took place over it was a 2-week period, give or take, and it's fascinating how much information can come out or can be discussed and learned about those 2 weeks. In some respects, well, it was a conference, and you could argue that all conferences were important, but the way that this is written, it comes across that this was an extremely important conference. You get the first inclination that this is where Churchill and Roosevelt really cemented their relationship and agreed that sort of it would be Germany first, and that sort of once Germany had been defeated, then the Allied forces would look to quash the threat of Japan. I know that had been mooted at other points, but when it was first mooted in August 1941, the United States was, for all intents and purposes, still neutral. So, given that both the United Kingdom and the United States were at war by the time this conference took place, it's an interesting argument that is made. It also comes across sort of the tensions that were there between the British Chiefs of Staff or British military representatives who attended, and also the American representatives, and sort of how they went about thrashing out the policy that would be pursued by the Allies. So it's a snapshot of one event, of one timeline, albeit a political event within the timeline of the Second World War. It is an interesting read. And I think it works because of sort of what was occurring at the time. I think if it was a book on the Tehran conference or the Cairo conference, then it wouldn't be as entertaining to read. I don't think... Well, you probably could write 200, 300 pages on any other conference of the Second World War, but I don't think it would have the same effect. I think what really works for this is the fact that sort of you had the relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, which is discussed. You've got the fact that the United States had literally entered the war 2 weeks prior to the conference taking place. The United Kingdom had been at war for the best part of 2 years. What was it? 2 years, 3 months or something by that point. So you've sort of got the somewhat experience of the British and the relative newness of the United States in terms of joining the Second World War. So you can sort of see how the United States was initially guided by Britain and Britain's experience of the war. Obviously, we know that things would later change as American troops built up American industry, sort of got to grips with producing vast quantities of weapons and became sort of the arsenal of democracy. But yeah, so it's interesting to see that sort of the way that sort of power was laying out at the time, in terms of Britain having the experience. So the United States was deferring to Britain somewhat in terms of strategy and what should be done, how the Allies should to coordinate their strategy, which does make this a unique read. I rather enjoyed it. Would I necessarily like to read about other conferences? Probably not. Probably be a little bit too dry, but this one definitely worth a read. If you've had the opportunity to read this book, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. If you haven't, I highly recommend that you get a copy. If you've enjoyed this video, it'd be great if you could hit a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any future updates, and we will catch you next time. Thank you.